So, thank you very much, first of all, for coming to our session. These are, I think, really interesting times to be working in education. For a whole range of reasons. You can't say that it's not interesting, right? You might agree with some things that are happening, you might disagree, but you can't say it's not interesting. There's some interesting stuff happening. And one of the most interesting things that I think that's happened in my time of teaching is this thing, this groundswell of interest in research and evidence that's come from the profession itself. I remember being at the very first ever research talk at a conference, and Ben Goldacre. Is anyone here at the first one? How did we go at the first one? Okay. And so he stood there, the very first one. He was like, "It's all got to be about finding out what works. We need to sort this mess out once and for all. What works in education? We're going to be very hard-headed about this, and we're going to do lots of randomized controlled trials, and we'll just get to the bottom of it once and for all." And if you believe in, other ways of doing things, if you question this new thing, then you're a dinosaur. You're like the history. This is the brave new future. And then Frank Ferredi, who's also here today, did the second talk, and he'd said, what works is a completely stupid idea, and it's just a stupid question to ask, and it's not about that, it's about professional judgment and so on. And right from the outset, I just thought, this is fascinating, this is just like this big, glorious sort of mess of values and experience and classroom practice and what people think education is for. So I've been sort of hooked on this for a good while. And so I'm like a research ed fanboy, if you like. I'm writing loads of blogs about it every year. I love this thing. Because it's so messy, because it's so complicated. Having said that, I feel a little bit like, not wanting to overstate the case, but like Daniel in the Lion's Den today, not least because Tom Bennett once wrote a book called Teacher Foolish, which some of you might have anyone read that book? I'm sure. A couple people, three. He wrote there's a chapter in that book called Learning to Learn to Learn to Learn, which you can see where it's going. And he says learning to learn isn't even a thing. It's not even a thing. We've been hoaxed again. The hipsters are selling snake oil on this, whether they know it or not, which is quite a strong statement, right? And it's quite a weird thing to think about, given that if you look at the EF toolkit, which pretty much every talk at research does and has done for years, sitting joint top of this ranking of what makes for effective practice is metacognition and self-regulation, which is defined as, sometimes known as learning to learn approaches. So either this thing is a total hoax and snake oil nonsense, or it's the most effective game in town, What's going on here? Let's see if we can get to the bottom of this puzzle. Actually, I have some sympathy with both of those views. I think that learning to learn, just like many things, right, in education, iPads, are they good or bad? It depends how it's done. Is learning to learn a good thing or a bad thing? It depends. It really depends. It can be done really badly. Anyway, before we get into all of that stuff, because I sort of studied this, we put this intervention together at a school down in Brighton, and I studied it for my PhD over 5 years. Before I get into all the nuts and bolts, I would like to introduce you to Kate McAllister, who's going to talk for a few minutes about. So Kate is a teacher longer in the profession than myself, and I actually met Kate. First time I met her, she was interviewing people to be part of this Learning to Learn team, and I think that it'd be interesting just to hear from Kate a little bit about what her thinking was before I met her, right? So she'd been doing similar things, a primary model and stuff at a previous school. So I'll hand over to you.
Hi, thank you for listening and being with me. So I've been teaching a long time, since and I worked in really difficult schools when I got my first jobs, and we had above average kids with special needs, we had way above average free school meals, and we had way below average GCSE results. And we had lots of what are known in the trade, or where that went, high tariff students. So I was the teacher who had, like the homemade cookies in my drawer, and the spare shoes, and the spare trousers, and I really, really tried to look after my students to make sure they wouldn't slip through the cracks, because if they slipped through the cracks where I worked, they often never came back up again. They would just literally disappear into the ether. They came from really, really tough families, and I did this, and I saved a couple, and I got all the way through to the end, and after 2 years I was dead on my feet. I was exhausted, and I only had 2 hands. There were only so many children that students, young people, younger ones, older ones, that I could hold, and I had to hold them really tight to get them through. So I thought, well, is there a more systematic approach to working with the students instead of me putting all of these interventions in for them? I decide what they need, I decide, I make it happen, I push those boulders up the hill with the top. Is there a better way to go about this? Can we work with the students so that they become better at doing this stuff themselves? Can we put them in control of how they learn? Can we make them better at being better at school? So this all this stuff was going on, and I didn't really know about education research at that time. I was, that teacher who comes things in over the weekend and baked all the cookies. But I started looking at the ways that we did things, and we started with a system where we had our students for our year 7s for 17 periods a week, and we got to know the kids really well, but their progress in subjects wasn't so great. And then we looked at opening minds, and we had 2 or 3 different iterations of how do you balance between getting the subject knowledge in and getting to know the kids and holding and instructing them from slowing through the cracks. So I've been doing this for a really long time and picked up lots of information about what was working for me in that context at that time, and the things that were working for other teachers who were working alongside me in that context at that time. And then eventually I came to this school to Seaview, and I worked with a head teacher who I had worked with before, and he created an environment where we could do something really quite special. One of the buzzwords at the time was transformational change. People were coming in from outside and saying, this school is not good enough, it must undergo transformational change. But you can't change anything, but you can't do anything differently. You can only do what you've always done, but we want you to get something completely different than you've always had. So I kind of put my hand up and went, you actually want to transform the outcome for these young people. You actually have to transform the young people themselves. And therefore you're going to have to transform the people who are working with the young people, because they're knackered. So let's start working through this systematically. Let's take different pieces that work in different contexts. Let's work with the staff that we have within the school, and let's start doing this systematically. Let's start measuring it and looking at it. And every time we got together and worked as a team collaboratively, the bottom line question was, so what? But I really want to do this next year. So what? So what? So what? So what? So what? Until we got to the point where I think, this is going to do this, and I will know if it's worked because. And that was kind of the beginning of this journey that we went on. And James is much better at explaining all of the ways in which we do it, the nuts and bolts of the research and how it works. And if I could have my time again and again and again, I would research different things. I would look at how it impacted on the teachers who delivered it, how it began to spread, and we changed the culture of the school within 3 years. We loved our jobs. We came to work happy, we didn't take time off sick, we achieved more and worked less over time, and it was really quite a powerful thing to be part of. And I can't keep doing it over and over again, so I've kind of stepped out of the classroom now, and one of the reasons that I'm here today is because I would like to work with you. How many of you are teachers? Yay! That's handy. And we want to be able to work with you, because you can't do it my way because you're not me. But I can help you to find your way in your context with your students, so that you can build up your kind of complex, stackable, evidence-based practices that are going to work for you. And I'm going to hand back over now to James.
Thank you. It really was. It was a thing that we all were really buzzed about. The people who were involved in this project, we were going around to each other's houses, holidays, and planning lessons together. There was like an unusual level of commitment to this project. So we just thought this is something really different. Before I get into the nuts and bolts of what happened, I'll just very briefly just sort of give a really quick sort of just a backstory of what this idea of learning to learn is. This chap, John Flavel, back in the 1970s, was doing some thinking about thinking, right? And he coined this phrase, metacognition. This word has come up in 3 of the talks that I've been in before today. It's like the word of the day. Metacognition, thinking about thinking. And he defined it like this. The monitoring, regulation, and execution, essentially carrying out of cognitive or learning processes, usually in service of a goal or objective. So straight away, he sort of said that thinking about thinking, it's an interesting idea in itself, but he straight away broke it down. He said there's a number of different components here. It's about monitoring what's going on and noticing stuff. And then it's about having some degree of sort of control over your behaviours and how you behave, how you learn, how you choose to learn in different situations, and how you actually go about doing that learning. And so he started to break it down, and almost immediately there was this like explosion in literature on learning about learning. Just like this thing absolutely went sort of exponential, if you like. And almost straight away from the 70s, we started seeing these educational programs that were saying, right, we're going to take these insights about how a brain works and how a mind learns and so on, and we're going to try to sort of formalize this into some sort of an educational program that will hopefully lead to accelerated gains. You can see that these things are not all identical, thinking about thinking, learning about learning, but you can see that there's a common theme here, and it continues right the way through to this day. And just to briefly look at, there's been a number of really quite large-scale attempts to make this thing fly in the UK. Here's 3 of them, and I'll look at one more in the next slide. I'm not going to go into this, it's a nightmare slide, but very briefly, Campaign for Learning. This was actually, their study ran for longer than that. They were still publishing in around 2010, 12. A really big study, 30-odd schools, where lots of different teachers, it's quite a patchwork sort of approach, so lots of different teachers were doing different things in different schools, primary and secondary. And essentially, they got to the end of this thing, this huge amount of work, effort, time, and they concluded that there was no clear evidence that it had any impact on the GCSE results or at Key Stage 2. This was a sort of a variant on it, which was very focused on assessment for learning and using assessment for learning as a way to get students to become more autonomous in their learning. Again, massive amounts of schools, 5 different local authorities coming out of 4 different universities, and again, we had this sort of very mixed story, like the results need to be treated with caution. Did it get any better? Yes and no. It was just, all this effort was being put in, we weren't getting the results out of it. And similarly with building learning power, which lots of schools have done. And yet, if you look at like the detail of the reports that these guys write, there's this common thread, which is that where there was like a coherent whole school implementation of these ideas, where everybody was on board, then we got to a place where we were seeing decent results. Same here, and Claxton says the same. And in a sense, it's a bit like what John Thompson was saying this morning, that how do you get 100 and odd people, 180 people, it sounds like a big school of his, all doing the same thing and all pulling in the same direction. And one of my things is that this idea of research ed, I sort of think it should be called implementation ed. It's not about finding out more answers. We sort of know the answers. The big question is, how do we mobilize this knowledge that we have? How do we put this into action through social policies and social practices so that it actually has the effects that it's supposed to have? And the other one was the RSA, who were one of the biggest sort of organisations to put out, and Kate mentioned Opening Minds, which was first piloted in the year 2000. It's since been put into action in over 200 schools. And a 2012 review of the evidence said that there are insufficient studies to be able to state whether or not it gets any better or not. And you think, well, if that's the case of the 200 schools, then maybe that's not it. And so you can have some sympathy with Tom Bennett's line. This thing, there's all this hot air around it, but what does it actually like? Show me a school where these practices are actually working. And it's a fair question, I think. So there's a few things I think that we could pull out. One of them is that lots of these things were happening during the noughties, if you like, which is an appropriate term for a time when all of this pseudo-scientific weird stuff was happening in schools, which Tom has done a great job of, slaying some sacred cows. And so lots of, in that slide here, it's talking about 3rd generation, 3G practices, which Claxton calls as things like brain gym, learning styles, and so on. And Claxton's got a more forgiving version of that. He says, yeah, those things, it was all pseudoscientific rubbish, but it was like this embarrassing adolescent phase that we sort of had to grow through. And like looking back at some bad haircut for the 1980s, you go, oh, but that was sort of somehow important to getting where we're at now, and we shouldn't disregard it. We should learn from it. There are, as I mentioned, there are issues of implementation. There's issues of scale. Lots of those studies are very large. Think about how complicated a single classroom is, let alone a department or a school. If you're doing studies across like 30 odd different schools, I would argue that the noise in that system is just so great that the signal will just be lost. And I think that we need to just look at one school at a time. Every school is different. And there's issues of interpretation. What even is learning to learn? There's questions around that. It's been interpreted very differently. So this is where we entered the sort of the field, if you like. 2010, Kate interviewed me for a part in this thing. I didn't really know what I was getting involved in. I just thought, that sounds... Huh?
I did hire you.
She did. She hired me. She saw something in me. And it was within the school. So we had 5 committed people on this project, and that's really key. There was a study published this year of a bunch of schools that do basically this thing, competency-based curricula, and they described the people who were delivering it as a mixture of volunteers and skeptical conscripts, which is, anybody knows, right, that word sort of, there's always some person who's maybe got a few hours left on their timetable, and age of austerity and all that, they don't believe in it, but whatever, it saves a few quid. And if you're going to do that, there's literally no point. That is just absolutely critical. Somebody said to me once, that's a criticism of this approach because we were all so committed to it. I was that's a really funny way of going around, a logical argument. No, I'm unapologetic about that. You have to have people who buy into it and whose values align with it, right? Some people aren't interested in learning to learn, and that's fine. But there's probably enough people in any school to make it fly. Who do. We use this combined approach right from the 70s. There's been this debate going on about whether or not you can teach this stuff separately through a taught course or whether it should be embedded throughout the piece. And most people agree that it should be embedded throughout the piece. But the problem with that is that, as I just said, most teachers don't really get it or buy into it or think that they've got the time in their lessons to develop it. So it doesn't work. So we just thought, well, why not do both, right? We'll do a taught thing, and we will try as hard as we can to embed these practices throughout the school, and we'll try to figure out how to transfer this stuff into other subject areas so that hopefully it'll lead to improved outcomes. We looked at the literature, right, and decided against buying anything in, so we thought, right, well, let's just start from the bottom up. What can we put in? Reasoning from first principles. Let's just treat this like a jigsaw. We'll put this in. The first thing was P4C, philosophy for children. I'd done my master's in. I was convinced of the importance of speaking and listening in helping young people find their voice and find an identity as a learner. And this, I think, this slide is the one. If you want to know what's different about what we did to what other people do, I would say it's this. Before I became a teacher, for a while I worked as a writer, medical writer in the pharmaceutical industry, and in pain relief, the idea of multimodal analgesia, giving people more than one kind of pain relief at a time, is really widespread. It's huge in medicine, and in psychotherapy the same idea applies. That you give somebody some opioids, and you also give them a local anaesthetic if they've had an operation in that area, and you also give them a massage and put some music on, give them a windows look out, and lo and behold, there's better pain relief with fewer side effects. And that, if you look at, I did this a while ago. If you Google education complex interventions, there's nada, nothing there at all. It's this idea has yet to introduce itself into the education world. And if you look at the EEF roster of all of the randomized controlled trials, it's always looking at one thing in isolation, isn't it? Does homework make the difference? Is it Saturday morning school? Is it this way of teaching reading? And everything's always in isolation. And I really think that we're missing a trick. That we should think, well, let's look at complex interventions. Let's take P4C, and we'll also try to embed oracy across the piece, and we'll think, what does metacognition look like across the curriculum, and we'll piece all that together. And so this is essentially, after 3 years of running this program, this was if you like, a summary of all of the sort of the components of our multimodal analgesia thing. But we've got longer than that, haven't we? So yeah, self-regulation, so project-based learning. This is in the taught curriculum. Collaboration was huge. Oracy, comment-based feedback. I'll take a picture of it. You can look at it if you like. So yeah, and in particular, this idea of transfer was really critical. Like, how are we going to get this stuff to transfer across the piece? Having a shared language of learning was really, really key for that. So we would say we had these values. You see them around this school. There's like 6 buzzwords, like collaboration, determination, whatever. But we were like, well, what does that actually look like? What does good teamwork look like? You need to drill down and focus on the processes of learning. What are you actually doing when you're in a team that's working well? What is that team doing? And so you have to have this. It took us a good while to understand this. To co-construct a shared language of learning so that the kids can start to talk about the processes of learning and develop an identity of themselves as learners. Assessing learning to learn is very, very difficult to do. It's something that you can't really do very accurately. Like with the thing itself, you have to measure proxy measures. So you can look at that, you can mark their project-based work. How well are they able to organise themselves over a 6-week period? You can assess their speaking and listening skills. You can assess, you can look at what they write and so on. But for the PhD, we looked at just the primary outcome of the study was, well, how are they doing across the piece? If they're doing better in their subjects, then that means that it's working, right? And if they're not, then obviously it's not working. And we did a whole bunch of qualitative stuff as well. And if you like the golden thread, that horrible phrase, which I just cringe at every time, and here's me using it. It appeared in a talk this morning. How does this, what's the line of logic here? How does this work its way through? So what is learning? Acquisition of knowledge and skills that is remembered, essentially. What's learning to learn? It's this process that Kate's talking about, the process of becoming a more effective learner. And it's a taught course that started in year 7. It actually grew throughout Key Stage 3 at our school. And it's an approach to whole school teaching and learning based around metacognition. What's transfer? That is, I think David Dida is doing a talk right now about transfer and what's good and what's bad about it. Transfer out of the learning to learn lessons. How do you go about doing that? And then how do you transfer that back into other subject areas? And if all of that stuff happens, then you should be producing more effective learners. And if they are more effective, then surely they should be able to achieve higher grades across the piece. And if they're not, it's like a good canary in the mine. Like if that's not happening, then obviously this isn't working very well. Maybe you need to go back. But I'm not driven by this mission to improve, A's and A-star grades. That to my mind is a measure of how well are we making people into more effective human beings. In terms of outcomes, this was a paper that I published with my PhD supervisor earlier this year. First of all, it was quite informal. We did pre and post CAT scores, start and end of year 7. Their CAT scores went up. There was much fewer behaviour points compared with the previous cohort. And so everyone was like, well, this is cool. Let's find some time in year 8 as well. And so we did the lessons considered into year 8 and then again into year 9. At the end of year 9, their attainment was much higher across all subjects combined. I'll show you a couple of graphs from this paper. Their attainment was much higher, and the gap had closed from the bottom up, which is obviously amazing, right? That's like the question that's on everybody's lips. So if you look at, so this is at the end of year 9, the grey bars is the pre-learning to learn cohort, who just had business as usual. They were very comparable at entry to the school. And the white bars is the learning to learners, who, if you think of it, had 400 fewer lessons of subject-based learning than the grey kids, right? So they should have been at a disadvantage, but after 3 years, they were outperforming the previous year group. Overall, there was about a 10% increase. It's not amazing, but it's it's a respectable increase over the previous year. And there was gains for non-pupil premium kids, but as you can see, these gains were especially profound among kids who are eligible for the pupil premium, who, as Kate said, there was lots of them at this school. And this slide is the gap, if you like. So at the end of year 9 in English, there was in the pre-learning to learn cohort, there was a 30% gap between pupil premium and non-pupil premium kids. And in the learning to learn cohort, where these white bars have gone beneath the 0 line, tells you that after 3 years of learning to learn, the gap had closed so far that it had actually gone the other way. So that in 5 of these subjects, the pupil premium kids were outperforming non-pupil premium kids. in the learning to learn cohort and not in these other subjects, which is what you would expect to see, isn't it? If social disadvantage was not a predictor of educational outcomes, then this is the sort of thing that you would expect to see. And if you average all of that data back together into these bars at the end, in the pre-learning to learn cohort, the gap was 25%, and in the learning to learn cohort, it was just 2%, which obviously we were very, we achieved what we set out to achieve, and we were pleased with that. So the standards went up. People premium kids did really well out of it. Non-people premium kids did really well out of it, and the gap closed from the bottom up to it's like this rising tide. Like if I had to draw graphs, I couldn't draw them more like how I would want them to look. Very briefly, last year that the first learning to learn cohort sat their GCSEs. They got the best. I was looking through my fingers, and it was such a scary moment. And they got the best set of results that the school had ever seen by some margin. And there was by far the biggest closing of the pupil premium gap in that year group compared with all the other schools in the city, in a year where the gap grew across the city as a whole. I'm not sure, how are we doing for time? Is this finished chat? We want to give some time for Q&A. I'll talk for another 5 minutes or so, and then we've got 10 minutes for Q&A, I think. The reflective learning journals was really, so in a sense we've got the input, this is what we did. And this is like we look at their results, but what we wanted to look at is like, what do the kids say? What do the other teachers say? Is it learning to learn that's having this effect? So here we see, for example, students saying, learning to learn helps with the subjects because it helps us revise and get ready for stuff. When we learn about fixed mindset and growth mindset, it's helping us to take in information and become better learners. Learning to learn also helps us with maths, because in maths you learn stuff like the area of a circle. And in science we learn the chemical formula of photosynthesis, but you don't learn how to ace a job interview or how to handle life crises without learning to learn. Again, like, you couldn't write it yourself. It's amazing. This one's really nice. This is talking about finding her voice. I can't see it massively well because of the light, but this is about like being able to express herself. And she's also saying that we used to get them to set their own homework as part of self-regulation, and she was like, I wish it was a bit more strict about the homework that was set, so she was struggling with that. And this kid, learning to learn doesn't help me in any other subjects. Bold opening statement. It helps with my listening skills and confidence in putting my hand up and saying something, but in other aspects it doesn't really help. It's lovely, you know. And interviews with a number of people. This is just a very brief excerpt from an interview with the head of PE who's saying these kids are really different. People talked about the difference between these sort of spoon-fed sort of zombies like hurtling towards through Key Stage 4 and these really dynamic kids who were critically engaging with each other. They were giving each other very honest feedback and not taking it harshly, and she thought that learning to learn had been a big influence in that. And this was a student this was after they found that the Year 9 program was being discontinued, and she said, I was really upset when I found that I wouldn't have the lessons this year, and then I thought back over everything we did in Year 7 and I realised it's part of me now, I can take it forward. It makes me almost cry now. So, we need to be a little bit cautious here, I think, because for me to be able to stand here and say, these kids, they did really well in all of their subjects, and that was down to us, rather than it being down to those kids or those teachers who worked so tirelessly. And so it's a very, very bold claim to be able to say we think that this Learning to Learn programme was at least partly responsible for these amazing sort of improvements. And so I think it's important to realise that, you can't know for sure, right? You can't know for sure, but you can look at the evidence. The fact that the school was in special measures is an important factor. Because you could say, well, when the school's in special measures, you're getting all this extra support, there's more money in there, and you could argue that was responsible for it. But I would say, well, if that is the case, then why was that not happening for the other year groups, for the year group before them, who was in the same school at the same time with the same teachers, and it wasn't happening for them? And there was also a history of declining results. People talk about regression to the mean as if a school's getting 15%, 5 A's to C, it's quite likely that the numbers will go up next year. Not because anything's changed, but just because of the way numbers work. There's just this thing, regression to the mean. But again, that didn't happen for this other year group. Why is that? What's the biggest difference between those two year groups? one of them had 400 lessons of learning to learn, the other one didn't. This is not some inconsequential thing. So I would argue that you could throw some doubt on those counterclaims, if you like. This is an important one. The fact that I was evaluating this program as the focus of my PhD meant that there was maybe like an unusual level of commitment to this, to making it work, which you wouldn't normally get in other schools. And I think that that's maybe a fair criticism. It's not something that you can really get around unless you make it a stipulation that somebody's got to do a PhD in the school in order to drive it. But again, what I would actually say is that like the impact evaluation, which is something that we do as we work with schools, we evaluate the impact of it. And I think that the fact that it's being looked at, it's like kids loaf, don't they? Social loafing happens unless they feel that there's some sort of assessment going on, in which case they jump to it. And so, yeah. As we look to think about maybe moving it into other schools, which we started to do, there are issues of reproducibility. Every school is different. Some schools are ready to start. Somebody here today, this week, they've just started learning to learn lessons, sort of based on the back of this model, they've been partly inspired by it at least. But some schools that we're working with are saying, yeah, we want to do that, but we're not ready to have a Key Stage 3 curriculum yet. We can maybe go do something else. Let's start with something in tutor time, we can do the PSHE. And scaling up is a huge problem. Like how do you take something that's effective and scale it up so that it remains effective at scale? It's very difficult to even think of any examples of things that have happened. Assessment for learning is often talked about as an example of something that was scaled up hugely, but led to some quite weird and wonderful practices which bore very little relation to the initial black box study, Black Mannion. And so the process of scaling stuff up, the fidelity, to what extent do people accurately replicate what was the original practice? Huge problem, but it's not insurmountable. So we're cautiously starting to work with other schools to develop this approach more widely, let's say. So right at the start of this, I actually stopped teaching this summer. So I've been teaching for 10 years, and it's partly to finish my PhD and writing up period, and partly because of sharing these results. Schools have started to approach us and say, let's start to work with you. So we're starting cautiously to work with other schools, and we want to do it really slowly. We approach each school differently, so we can do little bits of things. We provided schools with twilight on how to do a language of learning, giving them resources for tutor times and stuff, but we much prefer to work with schools on an annual basis, or ideally more than that over a number of years. And we do an impact evaluation as part of what we do, because I think it's very revealing, even if it doesn't show that you don't want to do it as a way to pin a badge on yourself and say how effective you are, but you need to be scrutinising what you do, and I'm a massive advocate of action research, every teacher getting involved in that. So yeah, and very lastly, we're thinking about, I don't know, it's probably one of the biggest audiences we've ever spoken to about it. If people are interested in hearing more, that's like a really, really condensed version of what we did, and there's loads of things to unpack and think about. And we're thinking of maybe putting a day on, maybe in London or Brighton or somewhere around November, December, and sort of just seeing if people from schools are interested in hearing more about it. Because it's difficult, just actually getting the message out there, how do you do that? And I think that holding some sort of an event is probably the best way. So, by my reckoning, have we got 10 minutes of Q&A?
Yeah.
Perfect. Bang on time to a minute.
I'm getting so much better.
Okay.
I'm just interested in the way that you organise your curriculum. So you know some for students have 400 hours of teaching, so where did you get that 400 hours from?
Yeah, so the very, very start, when Kate was sort of interviewing me for that thing, so the head had already set aside, it was 5 lessons a week in year 7, and that was it, and there was quite a small year group. I think there was 5 classes with about 26 kids, and there were 5 consecutive lessons as well, so it was Monday afternoon into Tuesday morning. And so he got those lessons. I was always amazed.
We shaved a bit from NFL, and we shaved a bit from humanities, we shaved a bit from other lessons.
But IT was a part of what we did, so IT came into it. PSHE really lends itself to this, so there's 2 lessons straight away. I think we might have done 1 from humanities, 1 from science. When it went into year 8, we thought we were going to, we had this meeting with all the middle leaders, and we said, we're thinking, I thought that there'd be much more resistance, but I think that by then people could see that this thing was
They were trying to give us more time. for a little while, then we actually don't need more time. Because by the end of that first year, everybody else, because I taught 3 subjects in year 7, so some of those poor students had me like all day on a Monday. That's what PE, that's what MFL, and that's what learning. So I could see the impact that it was having on, you look at the standard progress curve for the year 7, the one that we all know what it looks like, and then you look at the ones for the learning to learn cohort, and by halfway through the year they were really, really effective at learning, working together, understanding levels, what they needed to do to move up, and they were just scaling those ladders by themselves. So by year 8, the teachers were like, no, it's okay, keep them for a little bit longer, because they're all, they're making more progress by doing it.
Yeah, and just very briefly to come back, so were you asking about how is that time sort of divided up, if you like, as well?
It just that I just wanted to know which lessons in it's out.
I see, yeah.
And then what did you do with the others that weren't in the learning?
Took the whole year group.
It was a whole year group,
Oh, right.
and it's a mixed ability approach that's really key. Like, yes.
When you look at comparative data, you see it on here.
Yeah, comparing it to the previous year group. There's a pad going around somewhere. If you stick your email in the pad, I can send you out a copy of the paper. Sorry, there was a person here.
Can I just ask, did the children know they were part of this research project? Were they fully aware?
Yes, they did. They had to be. It was like right from the outset. So like the thing started in 2010, and I was finishing my masters at that time, but I already had an eye on the idea of doing a PhD. And so right from the outset, I sort of thought this is something that's really, really unique and worth studying. So from the outset, I got consent from the kids, so we sent letters home and stuff. And we were collecting data, so that with the questionnaire data, we gave them a whole bunch of questionnaires at the start of year 7 and then again at the end. So they were being studied and they were aware of that from the outset. But to be fair, they probably forgot it by week 2. It didn't come up as a thing. Yeah.
What was your process by writing the content of the individual lessons on learning to learn, and deciding what out of the large number of things that people describe as metacognition you would use in particular?
Yes. Okay. So to sort of think of it in terms of building blocks, so we had 5 hours, if you like, to fill in that first year. So the first thing to go in, as I said, was P4C. So they had a weekly philosophical inquiry, discussion-based lesson. 2 or was it 3 of the sessions were project-based learning. So we had 6 projects that ran through the year. The first one at the start of year 7 was a Who Am I project. There's a big questions of identity that are thrown up at the start of year 7. We've gone from a primary school to secondary, one of 200 kids all wearing the same uniform. So we wanted to give them some time to think about who they are. And we just said, off you go, Who Am I project, answer that question in as many ways as you can. You've got 6 weeks. And some of them would go off and start, writing lists of stuff and people that they're going to interview and to draw plans of their houses and profile of their pets and all of that stuff. And other kids were really floundering and they couldn't really do it. And because we had 6 weeks, this is this bit really, the self-regulation. Because there's 6 weeks, you can sit down and say to a kid, what's going on for you? Those guys over there are all getting on with loads of stuff. What is it that's stopping you from being able to do that? And they go, I don't know. It's just I don't know what to do. It's just they've never worked in this way before. And then you can go, well, why don't you go and talk to them? Ask them what they do. And then they go over and have a little chat, and they come over and they just go, just write to-do lists and take stuff off as they do it. Ridiculous. You're okay, why don't you try that? I can remember being like that. I used to watch people with filofaxes writing little lists. I'd be like, what are you doing? It's some weird obsessive behaviour. I didn't realise that that's kind of what effective people do. They just organise their stuff and have a method for doing it. So project-based learning was huge. Oracy was huge, so we would, as well as doing the philosophical inquiries, we would have a lesson dedicated to oracy once a fortnight, which would vary from term to term. It could be paired talk, it could be structured debate, we'd have things about public speaking, so they don't have to stand at the front of the room and do something like this. And then once a fortnight, we had a reflective learning journal session, so we would start that lesson with a meditation or a quick little guided visualization just to sort of calm them down and to create a space on which to reflect on their learning across the board. And we would have prompt questions for that, and you saw some excerpts from those journals. So that was essentially the nuts and bolts. It changed into year 8 and 9, but that was the essential.
I'm just quite interested in how you would bring it into
tutor time, because I think a lot of schools, there's a lot of pressure and they kind of tag SMSC on and they go down at anti-bullying and things that is obviously very useful, but this seems different as well, but something that is really important. How would you recommend bringing it in, maybe in that sense?
Yeah, if you want to drop us a line, we've got we spent bloody ages making this set of like tutor time activities, so that every morning, like were they done by year? I can't remember, but yeah, it was just like little mini activities, and it was all about using this language of learning.
Shared. So each time the students were using that language, the teaching went outwards via the students. So it kind of went in through us and then it went back out through to the rest of the school, and it kind of caught fire in that way. So they were using what they had learned, the strategies, thinking tools, ways of communicating. We could use that project time because the content is not, there's no content that had to be learned, there's no knowledge that had to be transferred. They were learning as they went along, making their own knowledge, they were building up skills. And that's what we put into that time.
All the teachers were in other subjects using exactly the same, so simply to just be using exactly the same language across the school.
Yeah, that's something that got better over
got
time.
better.
Yeah. So in the first year, all we started with was remember the PLTS framework, personal learning thinking skills. It was being quite unwieldy. It sort of fitted on a sheet of A4, but only just. There's like 36 criteria. We didn't know what they were by the end of the year. The kids certainly didn't. The second year, we had a language of learning that we came up with ourselves. It was a reinterpretation of the habits of mind, which we were really pleased with, but we didn't consult with the kids on it. We didn't really consult with the other teachers on it, and it just didn't live and breathe in their mind. That version, this version, in the third year, yes, then it worked, and there was a massive poster in every room with this stuff
Do
on.
you think it had an impact, the fact that other teachers were implementing on progress? So simply much quicker.
Absolutely,
Yes.
yeah, that's really like the most important thing, because one of the problems with learning to learn is that the skills and dispositions that you develop in learning to learn type courses don't transfer. Skills tend to remain context bound. Lots of people talk about this here. I mentioned David's talking about it now. Skills remain context bound unless that process of transfer is carefully managed. But obviously transferable skills exist. Like the very idea of a school would be ridiculous, wouldn't it, if we didn't think that any of it would transfer beyond the school gate. Yeah, I think we've just got time for one more.
Do you have a reward system linked into this, so when it's transferred when kids are successful?
Yes, is the short answer. Yeah. So again, just reinforcing that language every time. Okay, thanks everyone.
There are flyers on the desk there and outside if you want one.
Thank you. And if you want to drop your email on that pad thing by the door, then we'll drop you a line.
I don't have it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, I'm not really into that because the tutors and tutor resources are pretty much there's reasons we're not interested in that. Everyone's below. The tutor resources are actually happy
Once like an hour a week.
But the rest of the stuff, like we wouldn't do.
Okay.
I would like my training
because it's a hard sell. You want to sell it, it's a really hard sell.
Oh wow. Underscore machine on Twitter.
You've enjoyed it?
Yeah.
And it's
pretty intense.
Can you get in with those kids?
Like speaking and listening. When you're next,
Oh, you really have to. That's the last one now, is it?
No, 2 more to go.
Two more to go. Where are we now? 27? Oh no, I'm not now. I'm in 12. See you a bit then.
you know, for them to say, like, oh, I really enjoyed that, that's it.
But even to answer the questions, that's sort of validating.
Yeah, now I was looking for right hands. So getting them talking to each other about the around that, it's not like